This week on the APUSHow, we are looking at Chapter 8, Varieties of American Nationalism. What is nationalism? Well, that's pride in one's own country or the desire to become its own nation state. America was already its own nation state, but what does nationalism mean? Well, I guess we'll just have to find out. We'll see the building of a national market. Will the United States be able to retain a cohesive economic status, or will it become fragmented and broken? Americans will move on up to the west side as Americans expand westward, much to the chagrin of natives living there, and Americans will have very interesting experiences with Mexicans living there as well. This will be the era of good feelings, but who is actually feeling those good feelings? Was everybody feeling good, or was it just kind of a few wealthy white dudes? We'll also look at sectionalism and nationalism. America is a very big country with a lot of different sections in it. Will people feel the same type of nationalism for the same country, or will it start to fall apart and build towards perhaps a conflict between these sections? And we'll see the revival of opposition, as political power just can't remain in the hands of one group of people for long. Those group of people often split up and fight amongst each other, and we'll see that is certainly the case of the Republican Party. All this and more this week in the APUSHow. So the first section we look at in Chapter 8 is the idea of building a national market. One of the big things that caused this sort of sense of American national identity was a national market. After the War of 1812, economic growth was heavily stimulated, but it also exposed a lot of issues within the United States economically. First off, there was no national bank, which meant that states had to create their own state banks or local banks, which led to chaos. Back then, banknotes, or like dollar bills as we know them today, represented an amount of gold and silver. This was to ensure that your banknotes were worth something, your money was worth something. Everybody agreed that gold and silver were valuable. Nowadays, they don't represent gold and silver. They essentially represent our faith in the United States government to guarantee that dollar bills are valuable. But back then, it was on gold and silver. We don't do that anymore because there's simply not enough gold and silver to go around to make sure everybody can acquire wealth. But state banks would issue their own notes, which had different values depending on which state you were in, and that led to chaos because you could have currency that was specific to Pennsylvania, or you could have currency that was specific to Maryland or specific to New York, wherever you were. To deal with this currency issue, Congress chartered a second Bank of the United States. The first Bank of the United States charter had expired. The bank was so big and powerful it could overwhelm state banks and force them out of business if they didn't comply. Essentially, they could issue loans and take people's money at rates that regular small banks could not really compete with. And with the presence of a large second Bank of the United States, it helped regulate currency and make it more consistent and reliable. So your dollar was guaranteed to be valuable. With a stable supply of currency and more consistent means of banking and finance, this allowed the textile industry to boom in the United States, just as it had been booming in England around this time. Manufactured goods were heavily needed in the United States, and because of that, new factories were almost guaranteed to make money. One manufacturing giant, Francis Cabot Lowell, who was a Boston merchant, improved upon the power loom, which had been invented in England. A loom is basically a thing that turns thread into cloth, which allows you to make textiles. And textiles is anything made out of cloth, whether it's clothes, whether it's drapes, whether it's bed sheets, or whether it's like this towel that William Howard Taft is currently enjoying. Taft, you enjoying the towel? Good. Good to hear. And with this invention of a new power loom, this caused America to go from only producing thread to entire sheets of thread, which turned America into a blossoming industry giant. Early manufacturing efforts, however, were easy prey for English manufacturers and English entrepreneurs and merchants who could provide materials which were at the time in way better quality if they came from the UK. They'd gotten started in the whole textile business a lot earlier. American merchants and manufacturers demanded Congress act. They were worried that the infantile industry of the United States would essentially get killed by British manufacturers who wanted America to become a mercantilist country again to provide England with raw materials so that England could turn them into manufactured goods and make all the money, whereas America would just make a fraction of that. So, in 1816, American protectionists, these were the people that wanted the industry protected, that's why they're called protectionists, succeeded in getting Congress to pass a protective tariff. And this made British goods more expensive and thus undesirable for most consumers. This was great for American manufacturers and for the American economy, as it would now be able to develop its own industrial economy. But it stunk if those American manufacturers didn't make the things that you needed. If there was an English manufacturer that made the finished goods that you needed, that meant it was now going to be more expensive. And if there was no American-made alternative, then you just had to pay more money. For example, if you were a farmer who needed a specific tool like a seed drill and no one in the US made it, that meant you had to pay a lot more money to get it. But with a growing national market came the need to link the various sectors of the economy via transportation networks. Again, you got to link the various markets within the United States and link raw materials to the places where they turn those raw materials into finished goods. Right, Taft? Yes, right, exactly. The debate on whether or not the federal government should fund roads and other means of transportation continued. The government did help subsidize roads, which means they kind of helped pay for them, and some national roads were built which connected major cities to a larger degree. Growth and proliferation of steamboat travel on American rivers like the Ohio, Mississippi, and the Hudson helped connect Midwestern markets and economies to larger cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, where they could turn some of these raw materials into more finished goods. And steamboat travel was a lot more effective than traveling by horse because boats can carry a lot more stuff than a horse can. Boats can carry thousands of pounds of goods, whereas your average horse can only carry about 300 pounds. Remember, this is before trains and automobiles, so horse was still the best way to carry stuff over land. President Madison tried to add an amendment at that time to guarantee federal control over internal improvements, which were infrastructure improvements. Infrastructure are various things that society needs in order to continue to function. So things like roads, railroads, transportation networks, canals, even things nowadays like electricity, water, internal plumbing. Madison was able to get a law passed. However, that was not an amendment. And he was worried that without an amendment, that the law would be struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional, as he thought Congress was overstepping its powers. Because of that, Madison vetoed the law, which guaranteed federal control over internal improvements. Because of that, roads and canals would remain the responsibility of private enterprise and states. And the issue of transportation spoke to a larger issue of a massively expanding country at that time and how to keep this massive country together in practical senses like economics and politics. America was expanding westward fast. Remember, this is just in the wake of the Louisiana Purchase, so America had a ton of land and wanted to occupy it. In 1810, around 1 out of every 7 white Americans lived west of the Appalachian Mountains. By 1820, just 10 years later, it was up to 1 out of every 4 white Americans. Why do you think white people were moving, Taft? White people do love snacks, but everybody loves snacks. And it wasn't just snacks alone. There was other stuff going on. There's actually two major reasons, William Howard Taft. Opportunities and land were hard to come by in the East as the population grew and grew due to immigration and population increase because of birth rates. And also because of the War of 1812, most of the Native Americans were moved further west due to American government removal efforts that were as brutal as they were duplicitous. With fewer natives standing in the way, whites were able to freely take land that the government more or less stole from the natives. The few natives that remained in these areas within the Louisiana Territory were often supplied by government agents or factors. These are U.S. government suppliers who gave the natives supplies at a very low price. This helped do two things. One, it pushed out Canadian suppliers, and two, it helped the U.S. keep natives under control. So these U.S. factors could turn to the natives and say things like, oh, you don't want to move away from the territory that we want to take from you? That's fine. We'll jack up the price of food so you'll starve to death. Oh, you don't want to give up half of your land to white settlers? That's fine. We'll just jack up the price of medicine and your kids and you will get sick and die. It's a way of manipulation via economics. Speaking of economic exploitation of an entire race, let's talk about the plantation system in the Southwest. As cotton became higher and higher in demand, suitable land to grow it did also. Not much land was as suitable as the land in the areas of central Alabama and Mississippi. This would become known as the Black Belt of cotton production because the soil was often very dark and perfect for cotton production. As Southerners settled further west, they brought with them cotton, plantations, and the dreadful system of slavery as well. With the rapid expanse of population in the West, 4 new states emerged in the aftermath of the War of 1812. Indiana in 1816, Mississippi in 1817, Illinois, the glorious state of Illinois, in 1818, and Alabama in 1819. Looking even further west, most Americans had very little interest in the areas that we now consider the West. Places like California, New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona were under Spanish rule at that time until 1821, when Mexico assumed control of these places after it achieved independence. Mexico opened its northern territories for trade immediately with American traders, and these American traders would soon flood the region and displace Mexican and Native American traders. That's right, Americans crossed the border and literally took jobs from Mexicans, which means Americans would probably be pretty cool about borders in the future. Good to know, good to know. What's that, Taft? It's not going to happen that way? Oh, that seems awfully hypocritical and unfortunate. One particular industry that saw a boom during this time was fur trapping. Yes, Taft, that's right. Beaver pelts are back. Yeah. Get excited. Companies like Astor's Fur Company, which actually started in Oregon in a place cleverly named Astoria, named after the Astor family, Astoria. Just as a quick aside, if I ever found a city, I'm totally naming it Weberia. And Weberia is going to be an awesome place. You guys should pay a lot of money to live there. But anyway, the Astor Fur Company would reestablish itself in the Great Lakes region and would progress from buying beaver pelts from the natives directly to having trappers or mountain men acquire pelts for the company. The Astors were and are a notoriously wealthy family in the United States and in Europe. One of the more famous quotes from the family, which at one time owned most of New York City, came from Brooke Astor. Even her name sounds rich, who used to say, "Money is like manure. It should be spread around." It's estimated that Brooke Astor gave away roughly $200 million of philanthropy during her lifetime. Like I said, the Astors have an incredibly large amount of money. But anyway, getting back to the Astor Fur Company, the fur traders that worked for this company would establish the U.S. market economy deep into the continent as they provided highly sought-after pelts for predominantly wealthy Americans in the East who wanted to use the pelts for clothing for the most part. They would establish ties with natives and Mexicans living in the West, sometimes raise families with these different ethnic groups, or in the case of Jedediah Smith, make enemies and get murdered by these ethnic groups. Back east, most people had very little idea of what was happening in the West, as most of them never went there. It was a pretty dangerous place for a lot of people who were used to more civilized environments, and the trappers themselves didn't really write a whole lot of anything to share about their experiences. There were expeditions, and one expedition led by Stephen Long went through much of the region, but much like that of non-summit climbing fraud Zebulon Pike, Long falsely concluded that the plains regions were very desert-like, as he labeled this region the Great American Desert. Taft, what do you think about that? I agree. Total fraud. Don't even know why we're talking about them, but we are. And that brings us to the era of good feelings. With America living in a relative era of peace after the War of 1812 and the country expanding rapidly, it was an era to feel good. That is, unless you were black or a Native American or probably a woman. Then it was probably pretty lame and awful, but white dudes were having an awesome time, and they would label this awesome time the era of good feelings. It was especially an era of good feeling for rich Virginia statesmen, as Republican Virginians created a dynasty as they served as president for 2 consecutive terms, not once, not twice, but thrice. Jefferson, Madison, and James Monroe all would serve in the span of 24 consecutive years that saw Virginians rule the country. This was made possible as the Federalist Party was all but dead, thus giving the Republicans no serious opposition, and with no major wars or conflicts during this time, it was considered to be an era of good feelings, if you were a white dude. Monroe felt so good that after he got elected, he, in a very literal sense, paraded around the country, and even in New England, the former hotbed for Federalists, which were the opposite party of the Republicans, Monroe was greeted with enthusiastic celebrations and parades. Monroe's Secretary of State at that time was John Quincy Adams, yes, the former Federalist and the son of second President John Adams. Adams was a tremendous diplomat, much like his father, and worked to expand the United States, which he did in Florida. As Adams was negotiating with Spanish Minister Luis de Onís on the annexation of the peninsula of Florida after the U.S. had taken most of the panhandle of Florida thanks to Andrew Jackson, Andrew, I love killing Native Americans, Jackson was, well, doing what he did best, that is, attacking Native Americans in Florida as he attacked the Seminole tribe. He was told by then Secretary of War John Calhoun to take necessary measures to stop the Seminole tribe from continuing raids on American territory. So Jackson took that literally and invaded Florida and swiftly took 2 large forts from the Spanish and from the Native Americans. Realizing that Spain couldn't really stop the Americans, Onís agreed to give Florida to the Americans in exchange for the Americans giving up claims to Texas. And that is the Adams-Onís Treaty in a nutshell, and that is how we got Florida, Taft. Woot indeed! However, the acquisition of Florida did not provide lasting good feelings for the Monroe administration as the financial panic of 1819 set in. Here's what basically happened. Many banks, including the Bank of the United States, issued a ton of loans to people to buy land. New administrators of the bank got a little worried that they'd never see those loans repaid, so they began to ask them to be paid, also known as calling in loans. It's also worth understanding a little bit about how banks work. When banks take in money from people in savings, they don't just keep it in a vault and let it sit there. They usually take a lot of that money and give it to people in terms of loans. So if Taft were to give me $20 to save in the bank, if I were a bank, I would take that $20 and maybe give 10 of it away as a loan, with the idea being that $10 would then be paid back to me with interest, in which I, the bank, would keep some of that interest, and I would give some of that interest to Taft because he has a savings account, and one of the incentives of keeping a savings account is that you get interest on it. Well, this is all fine and dandy until banks get scared and people get scared, and they're worried that the bank loans are not going to be paid back, and so the banks demand these loans get paid back, and if people don't pay those loans back, then those loans get foreclosed, then the banks never see those loans get paid back, and then all of a sudden Taft's $10, which he wants to have back, can't get paid back because the people I loaned it to can't pay it back. It creates this big chain of events which causes a big financial mess, and that is essentially how depressions kind of happen. It's caused by a lack of confidence, usually poor banking banking regulation, and we'll get way more into this when we get to the Great Depression in the 1920s. But I digress. As many people couldn't repay these loans to the Second Chartered Bank of the United States, many of those which were to buy land, and generally we call those types of loans mortgages, those loans failed. Banks never got their money back. People that had money in those banks never got their money back, and thus a 6-year economic depression occurred. A depression is where there isn't a whole lot of money going around in a country because no one has any confidence in the economy to invest in much of anything, including people. And usually when you invest money in people, that means you're investing in jobs. People blamed the National Bank for much of this, and this would become a big political issue moving forward, as a lot of people hated the National Bank. Oh, and that's a big stretchums. Oh, man, what a stretch. Hope you enjoyed the big stretchums. Taft, did you enjoy your stretchums? Yes, time to take another nap. And that brings us to sectionalism and nationalism. Along with an economic crisis, the U.S. almost had a full-blown political crisis, which started with Missouri and revealed growing issues of sectionalism which undercut happy nationalism. Missouri wanted to become a state in 1819 and had already pretty well established itself as a slave-holding territory. However, New York Representative James Talmadge proposed an amendment to the Missouri Statehood Bill, which would prohibit slavery in Missouri and call for emancipation of all the slaves living there. Naturally, the slave-owning folks in Missouri and elsewhere in the country hated that idea. The slaves in the country probably thought it was a great idea. The slaves in Missouri probably thought it was a fantastic idea. But Congress didn't really care what they thought at that time because they were pretty racist. A compromise was reached as Maine, aka the lobster state, wanted to be admitted to the Union as well. Before this, it was part of Massachusetts and wanted to be its own state. Probably because of all the delicious lobster it didn't want to share with the people of Massachusetts. Lobster aside, Speaker of the House Henry Clay asserted that he and other Southerners would not admit Maine if the Congress did not admit Missouri as a slave state as well. Maine offered a compromise. Maine would be admitted as a free state, Missouri as a slave state, all in the same bill. Then Senator Jesse B. Thomas of the proud and powerful and perfect state of Illinois suggested that slavery be prohibited in the Louisiana Territory in all areas north of the 3630 parallel. Congress agreed and adopted the Thomas Amendment. Compromise was reached and slavery was solved forever. What's that, Taft? It was not solved forever? Big old Civil War, huh? Oof. Sounds like it's going to be pretty violent and intense, and we're probably going to spend a lot of time on it, aren't we? Oh yeah, big time. With the Missouri Compromise solving the issue of slavery for a few hours, we move back to old Johnny Judicial Review face Marshall and his Supreme Court of Fun. Marshall and his court proved to be extraordinarily powerful and perhaps as influential as the original framers of the Constitution in terms of how the country would work. Marshall helped to promote commerce as he often defended the validity of contracts, sometimes even if those contracts were corrupt in nature, as was the case in the court case Fletcher v. Peck. In Dartmouth College v. Woodward, a case was brought to the court where Republican state senators tried to revise Dartmouth University's charter so it would become public property of the state rather than a privately run university. According to legend, Marshall brought the court to tears with his defense of Dartmouth, and the college remains private to this day. Marshall was also instrumental in confirming implied powers of Congress when he ruled in favor of Congress in the case McCulloch v. Maryland. In this case, certain southern states tried to drive out the national bank within their states with taxes that were designed to destroy the national bank. Marshall determined that they could not, as he invoked that the bank was necessary and proper and thus okay for the Congress to do. So we see the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution coming into play here. What's that, Taft? Well, I think that would make you unnecessarily and improperly obese and unhealthy. Well, that request is vetoed. So what do you think of that? Marshall also established federal primacy, which essentially meant that federal policy superseded state and local policies. This was designed to promote a strong and unified and economically developed nation. Marshall would further solidify the supremacy of the federal government when it came to Native American land rights. In two cases, Johnson versus McIntosh and Worcester versus Georgia, Marshall's court determined that private citizens, like in Johnson versus McIntosh, and state governments, like in Worcester versus Georgia, would not infringe on Native American land. Only the federal government could do that. Marshall determined native lands to be like sovereign states, which the U.S. government had a special role as the guardian to these warred territories. Though this gave natives a clear legal position that the Constitution never gave, it still didn't do much to stop white people from stealing as much land as they could from the natives, and natives would get pushed further and further west into what is now the United States. Hey, speaking of stealing stuff from Native Americans, let's talk about Latin America. As Spain was sinking faster than a heavy thing that doesn't float, nearly the whole continent of South and Central America was in revolt. America remained neutral on paper in this whole conflict, but they would supply the revolutionaries in Latin America in the hopes that they would win and give the U.S. better trade position. Revolutions would sweep across the continents of Central and South America with success, and the first country to recognize many of these new states was the United States. Thanks to the work of John Quincy Adams in the Monroe Doctrine, I honestly don't really know, Taft, because he was president then. Yeah, historical names of things often don't really give credit where credit's due, and that's awfully unfair. I agree. Totally agree. It's pretty bogus. Anyway, the Monroe Doctrine, which was really the work of John Quincy Adams, essentially declared that the U.S. would interpret any attempt by Europe to take parts of South and Central America as an unfriendly act. Basically like an act of war. This was out of fear that France or Britain would help Spain make moves on some of these territories, and apparently it sort of worked, as most of these places stayed relatively independent from European influence. Mexico had some mixed up issues with France for a time, but for the most part, the Monroe Doctrine that was written by John Quincy Adams stayed intact and established the U.S. as the major power in the hemisphere. Look at us, Taft. Look at us ruling this whole hemisphere. Maybe not so much this hemisphere, but man, we are ruling this hemisphere. What do you think of that? Me too. Which brings us to our last section on the revival of opposition politically, because people just can't seem to stay unified on things. The Republicans ran unopposed in 1816 and had soon become the same type of centralized power that promoted commerce that the Federalists were a few decades earlier. However, new objections with federal involvement in the economy, as well as how the economy was supposed to expand, soon revealed major divisions among the Republicans. It's worth noting that until 1824, a caucus would nominate the presidential candidates. A caucus is a group of people within a political body, so like kind of a committee. So the Republicans would nominate a candidate to run against the opposition. Well, this was a bit of a problem, as there was no opposition in 1824 because the Federalists were dead. So the caucus nominated an extreme states' rights guy in William Crawford of Georgia. Other Republicans that thought this nomination was stupid, so they nominated a bunch of other guys within the party, including John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson. Presidential elections worked differently back then in that they were way more confusing, and even now they're pretty confusing. After all the votes were counted, Jackson had the most, Adams got the second most, and Crawford got the third. However, the 12th Amendment back then required the House of Representatives to pick out the top 3 vote getters. Crawford suffered a severe stroke, which pretty much knocked him out of the running, as people were worried that he'd be too sick or dead to be president, which left Jackson and Adams. Henry Clay, the 4th place guy, hated Jackson and endorsed Adams. This caused Adams to win the presidency and become the 6th president of the United States. Jackson's supporters would call this a corrupt bargain and would hound Adams on it for the duration of his presidency. Adams' presidency was marred with conflict as he received no support from the Jacksonian Congress. They blocked almost all of his initiatives, thwarted his diplomatic ventures, including attending a conference in Panama organized by Simón Bolívar, the main liberator or libertador of South America. Jacksonian supporters refused to go because delegates from Haiti would be there, and they didn't want to have to mingle with black delegates. Remember, Haiti was a state born out of a slave rebellion, and Jacksonian supporters, who were for the most part slave owners themselves, so was Jackson, didn't want to go because they would have to mingle with black delegates, and Jacksonian supporters, like many Americans, were super racist and all about slavery back then. Adams also couldn't stop Georgia from establishing its own treaties with natives, so needless to say, the Adams presidency was a very weak one. There was also the Tariff of Abominations, as it was called by Southerners. This was a tariff demanded by New England textile manufacturers who were also upset by cheap British textiles flooding the market. However, the only way Adams could pass the tariff was by adding other tariffs on it to make middle and western states happy. The resulting tariff made just about everybody mad and essentially was the nail in the coffin for Adams' chances in the election of 1828. Adams ran against Jackson in 1828. Jackson and his followers would adopt the name Democratic Republicans, and Adams and his followers would adopt the name National Republicans. They were both Republicans, but the Republican Party got so big that it kind of split in two. It kind of couldn't sustain its own size. Jackson ran as a populist, which meant he claimed to represent the true people and painted Adams as an elite who cared only about the wealthy. Adams would paint Jackson as an ignorant and violent tyrant, and the campaign turned very personal and nasty. Supposedly, it was so personal and nasty that the Adams campaign insulted Jackson's wife by claiming she basically cheated on her first husband with Jackson. Apparently, there was an issue with the divorce status of Jackson's wife when he married her. Jackson's wife was named Rachel, and when Rachel read these accusations from the Adams camp, she actually collapsed and died a few weeks later. Jackson blamed his political opponents for her death. Regardless, Jackson won the presidency by a relatively wide and sectional margin. Jackson won the popular vote 56% to 44%, as well as the South and West, whereas Adams won almost all of New England. Jackson and his followers would triumph the victory as a victory for the common man over the powers of privilege. Whether or not that was true, however, remains to be seen in the next chapter. Thank you guys for watching, and don't forget, we gotta keep pushing, G.